In today's screencast, we're talking the judicial branch. Now, this is the final of the three branches of government. As you can see on the slide in front of you here, this is the building that is known for being the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court building. And this sits across from Congress in Washington, D.C., made of brilliant white marble, and really is a wonderful sight if you do get a chance to see it. So let's talk about this judicial branch and eventually about the Supreme Court that works inside of this building. Now, big ideas that we must remember about the judicial branch is that under our system, the executive, legislative, and judicial branches share the responsibility of governing the nation. And the part that the judicial branch is charged with is to interpret the laws. That's their main job. Now, before we get into things, I want you on your note packet that you printed off and are following along with on the Moodle, I want you to take a minute to complete the bell ringer. Try to think of a time or two when that phrase, equal justice under the law, wasn't quite upheld by our judicial system. Take a minute, pause the video, and come back when you've thought of one or two different things. Maybe even do a Google search. When has the U.S. court system not treated people equally? Now that you've had a chance to kind of think of some times, or maybe even search for some different times in there, let's move on. But hopefully you thought of times like the civil rights movement, slavery, even the women's lib movement, any of those different times. Many people will say today that the gay rights movement of right now is another time in which the equality of the law is not given to everybody. But let's take a look more closely at the law and the things that courts deal with. But before we get into that, I want to talk about what our system stands for. And you'll oftentimes see this goddess of justice represented in judicial buildings, in the halls of the Supreme Court. And the dress and image is very important for a number of reasons. All right? It signifies what our court system is supposed to be about, starting with the blindfold. It's supposed to be that our court is unbiased. We don't give favor to one side or the other. That's why her eyes are covered. She can't see who is in front of her. It's also supposed to be balanced and ordered. And that's what this balance stands for in her left hand here. Liberty and order. It's all balanced out. Now, her uncloaked arm stands for compassion. Our courts are supposed to be compassionate to individuals and individual circumstances. However, there is a formal nature to it. There's a procedure. All right? There's a set pattern, things that are predictable. And lastly, the sword that she grasps in her right hand signifies the power of the courts. Now, this goddess of justice is often representative of our judicial system. So let's get into our judicial branch and talk a little bit about what they deal with. So there's three types of cases our judicial branch will hear. They're civil, criminal, and constitutional. Civil law are cases that involve property disputes, breaches of contract, family matters, or personal injury, where there hasn't necessarily been a law that was broken. It's two private parties that are battling it out. They're not being, taken to jail. No one's going to jail over this stuff. Oftentimes, you'll have to pay a penalty and do that sort of thing. You're not going to go to prison for these civil suits. This is like the TV judges that you see, Judge Judy in the morning, that sort of thing. Okay, so this civil law differs from criminal law because in criminal law, the state or the federal government is charging somebody with a crime, with breaking the law. So criminal law, a law has to be broken to be in a criminal lawsuit. All right. The last of the three is something called constitutional law. And these are cases that the Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights, gets called into question. And a lot of times it's dealing with people's constitutionally protected rights. Did the state wrongfully convict somebody or give them way more of a sentence than they should have? Is that cruel and unusual? Did they restrict their free speech? when they should have been allowed to do that? Are they establishing a religion and forcing Americans to join it? Those type of things. That's something that our judicial branch is charged with figuring out. Did they violate the Constitution? Now, I'd like you to pause the video here and go onto the Moodle to look at the judicial branch scenarios. See if you can figure out which of these 4 scenarios is civil, criminal, or constitutional, and then come back to check your answers. Pause the video now, jump onto the Moodle, check out the judicial branch scenarios, and come on back. Now that you had a second to look at those scenarios, let's check your answers and see how you did. In the case of the dog that kills the rabbit, case number 1, no laws are broken, so it's got to be civil law. There's no law against dogs killing rabbits, but there can still be damages paid, so that would be civil law. Scenario 2 with Mr. E, the math man, that's criminal law. They broke a law. There's breaking and entering. The law was broken. 3, the fly fishing bandit, that's a criminal law as well. You can't rob banks, all right? There's laws on the books for that, criminal law. But scenario 4, that's a free speech issue. That's a constitutional law. That's something our Supreme Court would be very, very interested in to hear a case like that, all right? So the 3 different types of cases, the 3 different types of laws, are the things that our judicial branch helps kind of figure out. That's their job. Now, when they were creating the United States government, the judicial branch was seen as the least dangerous. And Alexander Hamilton is quoted as saying, "The judicial branch is the least dangerous branch of the government because it has neither the legislature's power of the purse, which is the money, the ability to tax and spend, nor the executive's power of the sword," meaning that they can't really tax and spend our money, and they can't force us to do anything that they say. They have to rely on the executive branch. They have to work with the other branches. So they can't just sit up on the bench and say whatever they want and expect people to follow it. They have to get some cooperation with the other branches because they just interpret the law. They just say what the law is. Now, in our court system, it's split into 2 different sides, the state courts and the federal courts. State courts differ depending on which state you're in, but more or less they're set up in the same way. At the bottom, there are lower courts, all right? Lots of little tiny things, judges to hear cases in small towns. Then there's trial courts, which may hear larger criminal and civil cases. There's appellate courts, and appellate courts hear appeals. So if you don't think that the case was decided correctly the first time, you can appeal to an appellate court. And they can accept your appeal or they can reject it. And after the appellate courts, if you still aren't satisfied, there's the state supreme courts or the courts of last resort. Now, the way that that's structured is so that we can get a second and third ruling even to see if our rights were violated or if the state wasn't fairly trying us for a crime. Okay, so that's how the state judicial system is set up. The federal courts are set up very similar to that. At the bottom, you have what are called federal district courts. There are 94 of these in the United States. Okay, federal district courts. They handle the majority of the caseload for the federal court system. If you're not satisfied with how your case went in the federal district courts, you can appeal to the Court of Appeals. And there are 13 of these in the United States. Now, if you lose your Court of Appeals case, you can, or even if you win and the person who lost it isn't satisfied, they can ask the Supreme Court through a writ of cert. They can ask the Supreme Court to hear their case. The Supreme Court does not have to hear cases. They do not have to take any case they don't want. All right, we'll talk a little bit more about that in coming up. But the Supreme Court has 9 people on it. And if 4 of the people think, this is a good case, we should probably hear this and make sure that everybody's on the same page below us, they'll take the case. It's called the Rule of 4. they get 4 Supreme Court justices to say, I think this is important, they'll hear the case. Now, the federal court and the state courts, any court system really, has something that's known as jurisdiction, and that is the authority to hear and decide a case. There are 4 different types of federal court jurisdiction. All right, so your case has to deal with one of these 4 things, or the federal courts will not listen to it. The first and the most obvious one is the Constitution. Do you feel something is being, your constitutional rights are being violated? If you do, you have jurisdiction, or the federal court has jurisdiction to hear your case. 2, federal laws. If you break a federal law, or if you're being charged with a federal crime, you're going to be heard. It's going to be heard in federal courts. You're not going to go, to Marathon County Courthouse to get your case heard. You're going to go to a federal court. Things like counterfeiting, murder, drug trafficking, all these things are federal laws. Federal courts also have jurisdiction over disputes between states. For instance, years ago, the state of Wisconsin, particularly the city of Milwaukee, was flushing sewage into Lake Michigan, and it was traveling down and washing up onto Chicago's shoreline. Obviously, they were not happy about it, so they took Wisconsin to federal court to get money to clean that up. Okay, and the last one is if your case deals with the federal government. Say an army's out marching, they stomp on your dog and kill it. All right, you're going to go to a federal court. You're not going to go to a Wisconsin state court because you're taking the federal government to trial. Okay. Now, when you're in these different levels of the court system, they work a little different. Okay, and they are structured a little bit different. So what I want you to do is take a break, come back onto the Moodle, and start the second video called Federal Court Jurisdiction. All right, and walk yourself through that using the same guide sheet that you have for the beginning. So we'll see you on the second video.